So Gervonta Davis is easily one of the biggest stars in the sport of boxing. Many will argue he's actually the biggest star in the sport. I would argue he's top two, top three without a doubt. And me and Tank have had a little bit of back and forth in the past, a little over a year ago on Twitter. I'm not sure he's the most fond of me, and I've never really been the most fond of Tank, even though I have supported him as a fighter and I have rooted for him in the past. But in this video, I'll be telling you guys why I actually support Gervonta Tank Davis, even with our little bit of a history, a little bit of a past, nothing crazy, just a little back and forths on Twitter. But why I actually support Tank and why I think we should all support Tank Davis as a fighter and cheer him on. Now, Gervonta Tank Davis has been surrounded by controversy throughout his career, outside of the ring, but even inside of the ring, with him not taking on the best opposition, him not making the best fights, him being called a paper champion by certain fans. However, I've decided as of late that we should all be supporting Tank Davis and rooting for him as a fighter in the sport, and I'm going to be breaking down why. Now, first of all, Gervonta Tank Davis has a huge fan base in the sport, not just amongst hardcore fans, but amongst casual fans as well. I would say Tank Davis is one of the most known fighters in the sport amongst casual boxing fans. A lot of fans who don't watch boxing are supporters of Tank Davis. They know who he is. He's become a very big name, especially after his victory against Ryan Garcia. I felt the Ryan Garcia fight was going to determine who has potential to be the next face of the sport, and Tank Davis showed up and performed with flying colors. It was, in my opinion, the best performance of his career. Pretty easily. He looked tremendous in that fight, was very dominant, and got the 7th round KO victory. And the reason I think we should support Tank Davis is if Tank Davis does end up being a true star in the sport, if he ends up making the big fights, he ends up winning the big fights, and ends up representing the sport of boxing well, it can easily build the sport up heavily, and it can easily give boxing a huge lead over the other sports that they compete against, specifically MMA and UFC, but just any other sports in general. If we have a star like Tank Davis who's marketable, who's entertaining, but he's also taking on the best and beating the best, I do feel it is a win for boxing. Now, as I've said before, Tank isn't perfect inside the ring or out, but that does not change the fact that he can really help the sport of boxing out. A lot of people have talked about in the past, a lot of the people who defend the celebrity boxing matches like Jake Paul, they'd say, yeah, Jake Paul may not be a real fighter, he may not be a great boxer or whatever, but he's bringing new eyes to the sport. How much better would it be if we had a real boxer, an elite boxer, a pound-for-pound level fighter? I'm not saying he's on my pound-for-pound list. I personally don't have him on my list, but I do feel he is talented enough to be on the list. A pound-for-pound level fighter who's actually taken on the best opponents, who's very marketable, who's very entertaining, becoming successful in the sport of boxing. I feel it would benefit the sport tremendously if Tank Davis actually ended up being a successful fighter. I feel him not being a successful fighter, him losing or him not taking on the best or him being inactive, would definitely have a negative effect on the sport. Boxing is looking for its next true star. There are some guys that have the potential to be that star. When you look at guys with the natural ability to be that star, a lot of them are either on the way out, such as Terence Crawford and Alexander Usyk, or they're not as marketable as Gervonta Tank Davis. Now, Naoya Inoue is a huge star overseas, but it's going to be very hard for him to be as big as Gervonta Tank Davis in America due to the fact that he doesn't speak English, which I don't think is necessarily a huge issue, but I'm talking about pure star power in this country. Tank Davis, when it comes to fighters in America, American fighters, easily has the highest upside out of all of the up-and-comers. You look at all the other high-level up-and-coming American fighters, Devin Haney, who I truly support and I actually like a lot more than Tank Davis. Devin Haney is not as marketable off of his fighting ability, and I don't feel he stirs the pot as well as Gervonta Tank Davis when it comes to riling up other fighters, getting other fighters interested in fighting him, or getting the fans talking about him as much, even though I do feel Devin Haney is another guy with a lot of star potential. When you look at Teofimo Lopez does have that potential, but Teofimo Lopez has been a little inconsistent in his own right, and I also feel he doesn't have the name value of Gervonta Davis yet. I still feel he isn't as big of a fighter as Tank. When you look at Jaron Boots Ennis, who I feel does have that marketability off of his pure ability, his explosiveness, his entertainment, he's not as great of a speaker. He's not as entertaining of a personality. Tank Davis, in my opinion, has a very high upside. He's already a star in the sport. He's already arguably the face of boxing. I still have Canelo a little bit above Tank as the face of boxing right now. I think Tank is probably top 2 for me. But Tank Davis is very young. He's not even 30 years old yet. He has a lot of time. He has a lot of fights that can be made for him. He's a guy that can fight at 135, at 140. There's a lot of high-level matches that can be made. Him versus Devin Haney can be a future super fight. And I support Tank Davis when it comes to him making these big fights, when it comes to him being a star in the sport. As I said, I'm not the biggest fan of Tank. We've had our back and forths in the past. Nothing crazy. It's been over a year since me and him have had any interaction. And since then, Tank Davis, he's taken on Hector Garcia, which wasn't the best name, but a decent fighter. Wasn't his best performance, but he got the job done. Then he fought Ryan Garcia and looked absolutely tremendous. He's a guy who has millions of followers across social media platforms. He's been on pay-per-view multiple times. He's very entertaining. He has guys like Floyd Mayweather supporting him. He has Mike Tyson supporting him. He has a lot of high-level figures in the sport and a lot of truly respected figures in the sport supporting him. I genuinely feel that if Tank Davis does end up being a winner in the sport of boxing, ends up retiring, taking on top opposition, and making the big fights and giving the fans what they want to see, it'll be a huge victory for boxing. We have to put our emotions to the side, the people who don't like Tank. We have to put our emotions to the side and look at it for the greater good of the sport of boxing. If Tank Davis does have these big fights get made, it's a huge win for the sport. I don't know why people are against Tank Davis attempting to prove himself to be great. Now, obviously, these are all hypotheticals. These are all things that I want to see. It's almost like a wish list to some extent. I don't actually see him taking on guys like Devin Haney or Shakur Stevenson or Teofimo Lopez or Subriel Matias anytime soon. But I'm rooting for those fights to happen. I'm rooting for Tank to get the job done. I'm not saying I hope he wins those fights, but I hope he steps up and gives the fans what we want to see, because I feel it will definitely greatly be beneficial for the sport of boxing. Tank Davis can really help the sport of boxing out. When you look at the UFC right now, they don't really have many up-and-coming stars. Shout out to MMA Guru. I felt like when I was watching his recent videos, it really opened my eyes to that fact that there aren't many up-and-coming stars in the UFC. Let's be honest, right? Sean O'Malley, I mean, that guy is not going to be anything too big. Tank has much higher upside than Sean O'Malley, in my opinion. Israel Adesanya is older, and he's been losing fights. Sean Strickland, he's very marketable, but that's a guy who I don't think's that great of a fighter. He's a really good fighter, but he's not a guy. I don't even think he's going to win his next fight, Sean Strickland. They don't really have many guys who have potential to be huge stars. In boxing and UFC, they're almost competing against each other. They're in very similar markets. They're not in the exact same market, but they're in very similar competing markets. And when it comes to Tank Davis, he has so much upside, and if he does capitalize on it and ends up improving the star power like he did in 2023 when he fought Ryan Garcia, if he has another year like that in 2024, it'll give boxing a big edge. He truly has potential to be the face of the sport, and I hope he does succeed at making these fights, and hopefully they do happen in 2024. Tank Davis being a winner for the sport will benefit the sport, and I honestly think him not making these fights will impact the sport negatively. I hope these fights get made. I do support Tank Davis. I'm not necessarily a fan of him, as I said. He's not a fighter that I necessarily get along with or anything, but objectively I do support the kid, and I do hope that he does accomplish big things in the sport. I am rooting for him to make these big fights and get these big opportunities and give the fans what they want to see, because Tank is one of the few guys in the sport that if you ask a casual fan or someone who doesn't even watch boxing but knows about the sport in America, most of them will know Tank Davis. Thank you guys for watching. Tell me your thoughts in the comment section below. What do you want to see next for Tank Davis? Are you rooting for him as a fighter? As I said, I'm not necessarily a fan of the guy, but I do hope that he can keep improving the sport and keep making the fans happy. Have a good one, guys. God bless. I'll see you guys later. Peace.